in 2 Corinthians 6, Paul is finishing up his thoughts from the previous chapter, if you remember chapter 5. So this first verse really is relating back to that. He's talking about the gospel message, and he's saying that they're called by God to carry this message of reconciliation. So they're God's ambassadors. And now Paul says, so as God's partners or ambassadors, we beg you not to accept this marvelous gift of God's kindness and then ignore it. And so what he's saying is, if you want to put it in terms of our foundation series, you've trusted in Jesus for your salvation. Well, now go on to the second truth, which is to live to honor God. Don't just trust in God and receive this marvelous gift of freedom and kindness and forgiveness and then ignore it and then just live however you want. He says, for God says at just the right time, I heard you on the day of salvation, I helped you. Indeed, the right time is now. Today is the day of salvation. And then he kind of switches gears here, and he starts, not really switching gears, but he starts talking about his hardships, and he kind of gets back to this theme of sort of proving that they are qualified by God's grace and that they have worked really hard, but it's not because of their hard work, it's because God is with them and has strengthened them. In fact, in verse 7, he says, we faithfully preach the truth. God's power is working in us. We use the weapons of righteousness on the right hand for attack and the left hand for defense. Now, maybe he's referring to the armor of God. Like in the right hand, maybe you can visualize from Ephesians 6 the sword of the Spirit, and then in the left hand for defense the shield of faith. Maybe that's the imagery he has in mind. But when he comes down to verse 10, he says, our hearts ache, but we always have joy. We are poor, but we give spiritual riches to others. And the Corinthians were recipients of those spiritual riches. We own nothing, and yet we have everything. And so Paul is, again, he's sort of highlighting this difference between the temporal, the way things look in this life, and then the way things really are in eternity. And he's trying to bring that image back into focus, so this is sort of he's rounding up this, chapters 2 through the end of chapter 6. He's sort of bringing it all to a conclusion. And then he brings it to real practical application. And he says to the Corinthians, because remember, the Corinthian church was pretty dysfunctional, and these letters were written in the context of sort of having to rebuke them for the way they were living and some of the ungodly choices they were making. And he says in verse 14, don't team up with those who are unbelievers. How can righteousness be a partner with wickedness? How can light live with darkness? And he ends with this appeal to them to live to honor God in their lives, in their everyday lives, because again, he says at the beginning, he says, don't accept this marvelous gift of God's kindness and then ignore it. And so he's saying this gift that God has given us, this incredible reconciliation that he's offered to us, now that we're Christians, now that we're followers of Jesus, it should affect the way we live our lives. And that's Paul's point. So you're ready to read chapter 6 now, and we'll see you tomorrow for chapter 7.